I was 19 years old. I was an MP, military police, pulling the graveyard shift at a remote ammunition depot up in the Cascade Mountains in Washington state. According to standard operating procedure, if you spot an intruder, you yell, "Halt," and fire a warning shot. But that night, I broke protocol, and doing that is the only reason I lived to see the morning and tell this story. It was late November. The base was about 20 miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by dense, heavy pine forests. The secure zone was fenced off with high chain link topped with razor wire. I was pulling guard duty near Tower 4. The night was so dark, you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. Half the halogen floodlights on the perimeter were burned out, and maintenance was in no rush to fix them. I was in full battle rattle. Kevlar helmet, heavy plate carrier, holding an M4 carbine. You'd think being armed to the teeth would make you feel safe, right? Around 3 a.m., I heard the crunch of gravel. I peeked around the concrete pillar of the tower and saw a figure emerging from the darkness on the dirt road just outside the fence. At first, I thought it was a drunk local, or a poacher, who wandered too close to the base. The figure was walking straight toward me. But then, this person suddenly dropped down to all fours and kept moving forward. Its movements were completely unnatural, jerky, and wrong. And that's when it hit me. You've probably heard the phrase animal fear. Before that night, I thought it was just a cool metaphor. But in that moment, I physically felt an ice-cold electric shock travel straight down my spine. My knees started shaking so violently I could barely stand, and my fingers felt like they were permanently welded to the pistol grip of my rifle. I was completely paralyzed. The figure stepped out of the blind spot and right under the glow of the only working floodlight. It wasn't a person, and it wasn't a bear. It was massive, covered in thick, dark, matted fur. The creature walked up to the fence, slowly rose from all fours, and stood up on its hind legs, stretching to almost 7 feet tall. It had the torso of a man, long, muscular arms and legs with wrong-looking joints. But the head, it was the head of a giant wolf. It stood just a few feet away from the chain-link fence, staring directly at the tower. I stopped breathing, literally. I pressed myself flat against the cold concrete wall, praying to God it wouldn't notice me. The forest was dead silent, and I could clearly hear this thing breathing. Deep, raspy, heavy inhales that sent thick plumes of white steam into the freezing air. It felt like a scene from a cheap horror movie, except it was happening 3 feet away from me. My training was screaming at me. Issue a verbal challenge. Fire a warning shot. But my primal, lizard brain instinct was screaming louder. If you make a single sound, that chain link won't stop it, and 5.56 rounds will only piss it off. I stood as still as a statue. The creature lingered at the fence for about 10 seconds, sniffing the air. Then it silently dropped back down to all fours and melted away into the darkness of the tree line. I didn't move a single muscle until my relief showed up at 0600. When I got back to the guardhouse and told the squad what happened, they should have laughed me out of the room. Usually, guys will mercilessly roast you for telling a ghost story, but nobody laughed. Apparently, the look of absolute, primal terror on my face was too convincing. For the rest of that shift, nobody in the guardhouse slept a wink. I'm in my 30s now, long out of the military, but every time I remember the sound of that heavy, raspy breathing in the freezing air, an icy chill runs straight down my spine. I was renting a third-floor apartment in an old complex in Cleveland. Right above me lived a guy named Gary. He was in his 40s, on disability, and lived with his frail, severely ill mother. Because of the terrible soundproofing, I knew their every move, especially the old lady's footsteps. She wore these heavy orthopedic slippers that made a very distinct sound. Scuff. Step. Scuff. About a year ago, tragedy struck. and the building filled with a smell I will never forget. Gary had been admitted to an inpatient rehab clinic for a few weeks. His mother was left home alone. At some point, I started noticing a strange, sickeningly sweet, rotting smell seeping through the bathroom vents. The neighbors called the police for a wellness check. The cops kicked down the door to apartment 4B. It turned out the old woman had tried to run a bath and suffered a massive heart attack. She had been lying in the water for nearly 2 weeks. The scene, according to the cops, was so gruesome that one of the rookie officers threw up right in the hallway. They cleaned the apartment out. Gary came back from rehab to a completely empty home, and the grief absolutely broke him. Every single night, I would lie in my bed and listen to him get drunk and howl. It wasn't just crying. It was an animalistic wail. He would talk to his dead mother, begging her to forgive him for not being there. It was agonizing to listen to. But in late April, everything changed. It was 3:30 a.m. I woke up to the deafening groan of the old plumbing pipes. Upstairs, right above my head, the bathtub was filling up with full water pressure. I lay there thinking, who in their right mind takes a bath at 3 in the morning? And then, cutting right through the sound of the running water, came a blood-curdling, terrifying scream. It was Gary. "Mom! No! Mom! Don't come near me! Don't look at me!" Then came a massive crash. It sounded like a heavy bookshelf being tipped over. That was followed by the rapid thud of heavy, bare feet sprinting down the hallway, and the front door slamming shut so hard my windows rattled. I crept over to my peephole. Gary was out in the hallway. He was clawing at his own face, howling, backing himself into a corner while staring at his open door. The neighbors called 911. The paramedics sedated him, strapped him to a gurney, and took him away. He never came back. They kept him on a permanent psychiatric hold. The landlord came by the next day, checked apartment 4B, made sure it was empty, flipped the breakers, and put a heavy padlock on the front door. I sighed with relief. I thought I could finally get a decent night's sleep. Skeptics will say that stress plays cruel tricks on our minds. But I'm typing this right now, sitting in my kitchen, and my hands are shaking. Because the apartment upstairs has been officially locked and sealed for 2 weeks. Nobody has gone in or out. But 3 days ago, at 3:30 in the morning, I woke up in a cold sweat. Right above my ceiling, footsteps started walking. Scuff, step, scuff. The distinct sound of those old orthopedic slippers. The footsteps slowly shuffled from the bedroom to the bathroom. And then, the old pipes in the wall shuddered. The rusty faucet squealed, and I clearly heard the bathtub starting to fill with water in the empty padlocked apartment. I called the landlord. He came during the day, unlocked the padlock. Inside there was a thick layer of dust, a bone-dry tub, and not a single living soul. He thinks I'm losing my mind. But the neighbors next door can hear it too. People say grief can drive a man insane. But sometimes, I think Gary cried so loud and so long that he reached her. He woke something up in that apartment. And now, whatever it is, it's taking a bath right above my head every single night. It was 2004. I was 12, and my older brother Connor was 15. We were getting ready to leave for a 3-week summer camp up in the Pennsylvania mountains. Our grandmother, Nana Rose, lived with us. She had arthritis, so she rarely left the house. The morning my dad was loading our duffel bags into the minivan, my grandmother came into the hallway to see us off, and that goodbye dragged on way longer than usual. Normally, Nana Rose would just give us a quick peck on the cheek and go back to watching her soap operas. But that day, she grabbed onto me like I was being shipped off to a war zone. She hugged me tight, breathing heavily. She smelled like peppermint and old talcum powder. Then she grabbed Connor, tears in her eyes, and literally refused to let go of his jacket. When we finally made it to the driveway, my brother adjusted his backpack and muttered, "She was acting really weird today. It felt like we were leaving forever." I just shrugged it off. I was a kid. My mind was entirely focused on summer camp. Camp lasted 3 weeks. Our parents came up for visiting day, but Nana wasn't with them. Mom said Nana was just feeling a little under the weather. When camp finally ended, my dad drove us home. We dragged our bags onto the front porch. That's when I noticed something wrong. My mom pulled out her keys to unlock the front door. Nana Rose was always home. Usually, she'd hear us on the porch and open the door for us. But the house was locked, totally silent, and smelled stale. The gears in my 12-year-old head suddenly clicked into place. That long, desperate hug, the tears, the locked door. I dropped my bag on the floor and screamed hysterically down the hallway, tears streaming down my face. "She's dead, isn't she? Nana died." My mom covered her face with her hands and broke down, sobbing. My dad pulled us into a hug. It turned out Nana Rose had suffered a massive heart attack just 6 hours after Connor and I left for camp. My parents deliberately didn't tell us so they wouldn't ruin our summer, and they held the funeral while we were gone. 2 years went by. We learned to live without her. It was a totally normal, rainy Tuesday night. Our entire family, me, my brother, my mom, and my dad, were sitting in the living room, eating takeout pizza and watching TV. We had one of those massive, heavy CRT televisions back then. We were watching an episode of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Regis Philbin asked some joke question. The contestant answered, and the studio audience erupted in laughter. The cameraman, as they often do on game shows, slowly panned the camera away from the host and swept across the studio audience clapping. And suddenly, I froze. The slice of pizza literally slipped out of my hand and hit the floor. Sitting in the third row of the studio audience, surrounded by laughing people, was Nana Rose. She wasn't clapping. She wasn't smiling. She was sitting perfectly straight, staring dead into the camera lens, staring right at us. She was wearing a very specific, high-collared navy blue dress. And I knew I wasn't just seeing things, because a split second later, my mom let out this piercing, inhuman shriek that made my ears ring. My dad jumped out of his recliner, knocking over a tray of drinks. My brother Connor backed up against the wall, covering his mouth in horror. We all saw her, the entire family. We instantly recognized that dress, because as my mom later sobbed in absolute hysterics, that navy blue dress was exactly what Nana Rose was wearing when they buried her. The camera lingered on her face for maybe 3 seconds, and then the heavy television let out a loud crack and the screen went completely black. An absolute dead, ringing silence fell over our living room. None of us were even breathing. And in that moment of pure silence, there was a deafening explosion. The massive sliding glass door leading from our living room to the backyard violently shattered. The glass exploded inward, showering the living room carpet with thousands of shards, as if the door had been hit by an invisible shock wave. A freezing night wind howled through the empty frame into the house. The police who responded to the 911 call said the glass shattered due to a barometric pressure drop from the thunderstorm. The repair guy later said the TV just had a blown cathode ray tube. People always try to find a logical explanation. But I'm in my 30s now, and I still remember that dead, cold stare coming through the television screen. And I know for a fact, that night, someone, or something, came into our house to finish that goodbye. When I was 15, my stepdad, Ray, suddenly died of a heart attack. My mom was left drowning in bills, so she picked up night shifts at a diner to save our house. I was home alone a lot. That winter night, I just turned on the old gas heater, lay down on the couch, and fell asleep. I didn't know the exhaust vent was blocked. I just thought I was having a nightmare. A nightmare where our house was being boarded up from the outside, turning it into a coffin. The dream started out completely normal. I was sitting in our living room when suddenly the front door opened, and Ray walked in. He was wearing his usual work jacket, acting like nothing happened. In the dream, I didn't even remember that he was dead. Right then, I heard my friends outside calling me to come hang out. I jumped up and said, "Ray, can I have $1 for ice cream?" He looked at me with this sad expression, patted the right pocket of his jacket, pulled out a handful of change and said, "I don't have $1, Chloe. I've only got 87 cents. I was annoyed, turned to walk out the front door, and suddenly heard a deafening banging sound. Whack! 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 I looked at the windows. Outside, there were faceless workers nailing thick wooden planks over the glass. They were boarding up the house. The front door was already half covered in heavy wood. I panicked and turned to my stepdad. "Ray, what are they doing? How are we supposed to get out?" Ray's face suddenly changed. It went gray and mean. He answered in a completely dead, calm voice. "We don't need doors anymore, Chloe. We aren't going anywhere." The room was getting darker by the second. I saw that there was one tiny gap left at the very bottom of the front door, and a worker outside was raising his hammer to nail the final board over it. Pure animal survival instinct pushed me forward. I threw myself on the floor and crawled toward that gap with everything I had. I snapped my eyes open. I was lying in the snow in my front yard. The red and blue lights of an ambulance were flashing, and my mom was kneeling next to me, crying uncontrollably. As it turned out, I wasn't rescued by some random passerby. My mom had just gotten off her night shift at the diner an hour early. When she opened the front door, she was hit by a wall of toxic air. She found me unconscious on the living room floor. My suffocating brain had tried to force my body to crawl to the exit, but I passed out halfway there. My mom dragged my dead weight out into the freezing snow and called 911. The paramedics said I was minutes away from dying. Later in the hospital, when I was finally stable, I decided to tell my mom about the awful nightmare. I told her about the workers boarding up the house and how Ray just stood there calmly, trying to keep me inside. And then I casually mentioned the detail about the change. "He said he didn't have $1, I rasped. "He showed me the coins and said, 'I've only got 87 cents, and put them back in his right pocket. The second I said that, all the color drained from my mom's face. She physically recoiled from the bed and clutched her chest, like she suddenly couldn't breathe. Later, she confessed it to me. On the day of Ray's funeral, the funeral director told her about an old superstition, that you're supposed to put a few coins in the deceased's pocket to pay the ferryman. My mom was completely broke at the time. She emptied her entire purse and only managed to scrape together a handful of loose change, exactly 87 cents. She slipped those coins into the right pocket of Ray's suit jacket right before they closed the casket. She never told a single soul about it, not even me, because she felt so incredibly ashamed that she had put such a pathetic amount in there. So maybe it really was just a carbon monoxide hallucination. But I know one thing for sure. That night, my stepdad was trying to lock me in there with him. And it's a miracle I made it out of that coffin. That summer, our camp counselors decided to put us through survival night. They took our group of 16-year-olds deep into the woods, made us build lean-tos out of branches, and left us to sleep alone on the shore of a wild, pitch-black lake. We thought it would be fun. We were roasting marshmallows and telling stories, completely unaware that we weren't alone in the woods that night, and that something was creeping closer to our camp. It all started with a single footprint in the sand. Around midnight, one of the guys walked down to the water to wash his hands, and suddenly called us over. Right there, on the wet sand, a few feet from the water, was a clear paw print. It was massive, easily 1.5 times the size of a German shepherd's paw, but that wasn't the scary part. The scary part was that there was only one. There was no trail of prints leading to the water or coming out of it. Just one perfect, heavy paw print pressed deep into the sand. It looked as if a giant wolf had dropped out of the sky, stepped on the beach, and flown away. We tried to rationalize it and nervously laughed it off, but a creeping sense of dread settled over all of us. Around 2 a.m., we started running out of firewood. My friend Chloe volunteered to go into the woods to grab some dead branches. Chloe was a tomboy, super athletic, and absolutely fearless. She was usually the one pranking the rest of us. She grabbed a flashlight and walked into the dark. She was gone for almost 40 minutes. We were getting seriously worried, and were about to go wake up the counselors when Chloe suddenly walked out of the trees, completely empty-handed. She was pale as a ghost. She didn't say a word. She just sat heavily on a log, wrapped her arms around herself, and stared blankly into the fire. We started shaking her, asking what happened. She looked at us with totally glassy, empty eyes, and whispered, "There are people out there." She told us she had walked pretty deep looking for dry wood. Suddenly, she saw a small clearing illuminated by the moonlight. Standing there were 2 female figures. They were wearing tattered, white nightgowns that were completely soaked, like they had just crawled off the bottom of the lake. "I thought it was some of the counselors trying to scare me," Chloe said, her voice shaking. "I shined my flashlight on them, and they turned to look at me." According to her, instead of normal faces, they had this mess. Their faces were unnaturally stretched vertically. Their eyes drooped low on their cheeks, and their mouths hung open in this massive, unnatural O shape. It looked like gravity was forcefully pulling their skin down. They didn't make a single sound. Chloe just clicked off her flashlight, and slowly, trying not to breathe, backed away into the darkness until she reached our campfire. We had known Chloe for years. She could never act like that. She was physically shivering. For the rest of the night, we didn't step a foot away from the fire. We just sat there, huddled together. The absolute craziest thing happened right before dawn. Around 5 a.m., the sky was just starting to turn gray. My friend Josh decided to run to his lean-to to grab a hoodie and his disposable Kodak camera. We wanted to take a picture of that weird footprint on the beach before it washed away. Josh's lean-to was about 15 yards away from the fire, tucked between the trees. He walked over, and literally a minute later, we saw a bright white flash coming from inside his shelter. A second later, Josh came flying out of the trees, screaming at the top of his lungs. He tripped over a root and tumbled right up to our fire in a state of pure panic. When we finally calmed him down, he told us that he walked up to his lean-to and peeked inside. His disposable camera was sitting on his sleeping bag, and as he was looking at it, the internal motor whirred, winding the film completely on its own. It clicked, and the flash went off right in his face. Someone, or something, was sitting inside his lean-to in the pitch black, and took a picture of him the exact second he looked in. Obviously, we couldn't check the photo right then because it was film. Josh shoved the camera deep into his backpack and swore he would get the film developed as soon as he got back to the city to show us what was on it. Camp ended, and we all went home. But Josh never sent us the photos. At first, he made excuses about forgetting to drop the film off at the pharmacy. Then, he completely stopped answering our calls. The following school year, his parents abruptly transferred him to a different high school, and he dropped off the grid entirely. He cut all ties with us. I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night and wonder, what exactly did Josh see on that developed photograph? What was waiting for him in that lean-to? When I was 19, my family lived in the suburbs of Columbus, Ohio. We had a great life. My dad ran a small contracting business. My parents were happily married, and my brother and I were doing well in school. My mom had a friend, let's call her Brenda. She was a loud, single woman in her 40s who had terrible luck with men. She spent almost every single weekend at our house. She would show up in the morning and stay until late at night. Every time I opened the front door for her, she would throw her arms wide open and sigh loudly. God, I am so jealous of you guys. You have such a great family. I never want to leave this place. I want this exact life. Back then, we just took it as a clumsy compliment. But then, we hit a massive streak of bad luck, and it happened completely out of nowhere. First, my mom got seriously ill. The doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong. Her tests were fine, but she was just wasting away and couldn't get out of bed. My dad lost several major contracts, and his business was suddenly on the verge of bankruptcy. My brother got picked up by the police twice. Once they confused him with a suspect, and another time he was just standing near a street fight. I started having panic attacks and broke up with my boyfriend. But the creepiest part was what happened with the dogs. We fostered golden retriever puppies. We would bring home a completely healthy pup. Brenda would come over for the weekend to play with it, and 2 days later, the puppy would suddenly die. The vets had no explanation. My mom was absolutely desperate. A coworker saw how awful she looked and recommended a woman who specialized in spiritual house cleansings. My mom went to see her. The woman didn't even ask for details. She just said, "You have a woman who visits your house constantly. She sits at your table and is insanely jealous of you. Because of this, your house is filled with a ton of negative energy." She gave my mom instructions on how to cleanse the house. It had to be done in secret. That evening, my mom poured special salt in the corners of the rooms and lit church candles. I saw it myself. The candles smoked with thick black soot, and the wax melted into these ugly, deformed clumps. When my mom swept the salt into a dustpan, it wasn't white anymore. It was black as coal. My mom didn't tell anyone about the cleansing. A week went by, and it honestly felt easier to breathe inside the house. On Saturday, Brenda called like usual and said she was dropping by. 20 minutes later, the doorbell rings. I go to open it, fully expecting her usual wide-open arms. I swing the door open and freeze. Brenda is standing on the porch, looking completely shell-shocked. Her eyes are wide open. She's staring at me like she just saw a ghost. "Hey, come on in," I say. But she just stands there, breathing heavily, and mumbles, I don't understand. I thought I had the wrong house." I rang the doorbell, and for some reason, I was 100% sure a total stranger was going to open the door. "I don't recognize your house at all." She eventually stepped inside, and we sat at the kitchen table. But Brenda couldn't sit still. She kept squirming in her chair, looking around, literally shaking. You could tell she was physically uncomfortable being inside. After about 10 minutes, she couldn't take it anymore, mumbled something about having urgent errands, and basically ran out of our house. She never came back. Not once. We tried calling her and inviting her over, but she always made up excuses. As soon as Brenda disappeared from our lives, everything went back to normal. My dad landed a huge contract. The police left my brother alone, and my mom got her health and energy back. A while later, we found out that Brenda had gotten cancer. She passed away very quickly. I don't know exactly how these things work, but I feel like when we cleansed the house and blocked her envy from getting in, all that negativity had nowhere else to go. So it just bounced right back to her. It all started when I turned 25. I didn't see ghosts or anything. Strange, cold thoughts that definitely didn't belong to me just started popping into my head. I was learning things I physically couldn't have known, and the scariest part wasn't the fear that I was losing my mind. The scariest part was that these voices were always right. They were sudden, sharp flashes of information. I was working a corporate job in Chicago. One morning, walking into the building, I saw a manager's blue Ford Mustang parked in the lot, and I clearly heard a voice in my head say, "Crushed." The very next day, that manager got into a horrible wreck. The hood of his car was completely pancaked. Then it started happening with my work. A major client came to us, and the deal looked incredibly lucrative. But the voice in my head barked, "Don't take him, he's rotten." I made up some stupid excuse and handed the client off to a coworker. A month later, it turned out the guy was a total scam artist. He bled the company dry, ghosted everyone, and never paid. Then, I saved a person's life. I was having lunch with a coworker. Let's call her Sarah. I was sipping my coffee, looked at her, and the voice just said, "Tumor." I looked her dead in the eye and said, "Go get a mammogram." She looked at me like I was insane and literally rolled her eyes. But just for peace of mind, she went. They found a highly aggressive tumor in its earliest stage. They operated in time and saved her life. After that, rumors started spreading around the office. People started coming up to me, asking me for help or a reading. But I couldn't control it. This wasn't a gift I could just turn on and off. I started going crazy. I would hear who was cheating on who. I'd learn dirty secrets about random people passing me on the street. I knew who was going to die soon. The mental weight was unbearable. Being a rational person, I went to the doctors. I did blood panels, got an MRI of my brain, and saw 3 different psychiatrists. I literally begged them to diagnose me with schizophrenia and give me pills. But they just threw their hands up. Clinically, my brain was perfectly healthy. I lived in this personal hell for 4 years. I went to church, I prayed, but the voices only got louder. Eventually, I had a total nervous breakdown and confessed everything to my older sister. My sister was really into genealogy and remembered an old family rumor about someone on our dad's side being a healer. We got a subscription to an ancestry site and started digging into our family tree. And we found her. She was my great-grandmother's cousin, and she lived in a remote village deep in the Appalachian Mountains in West Virginia. The locals called her a root doctor or a faith healer. The creepiest part? She and I shared the exact same first name. We found the coordinates of the old cemetery where she was buried, rented a car, and drove out there. It was a forgotten, overgrown graveyard in the middle of the woods. When I walked up to her crooked headstone, the scariest thing happened. The voices in my head merged into a deafening, unified roar. My skull felt like it was on fire. I thought my eardrums were going to burst. It was peaking. I dropped to my knees right in the dirt, grabbed her headstone, and just started begging. Out loud. I pleaded with her to take it back. I screamed that I didn't want this gift and that I couldn't handle it. And suddenly, it just snapped. Absolute ringing silence. All I could hear was the wind and the rustling leaves. My head was completely empty and calm. I'm almost 40 now. Since that day at the cemetery, I haven't heard a single voice or a single borrowed secret. I live a normal, boring life. But now, whenever someone says the supernatural isn't real, I just keep my mouth shut. Because I know for a fact, there are things in this world that medicine will never be able to explain. Every family has its weird stuff. Some people have relatives who drink, some have relatives in jail, and in my family, my grandma was considered the local witch. I grew up in the Ozark Mountains in Missouri. We were pretty poor. My dad died in a quarry accident, and my mom worked double shifts at a diner to support me and my 4-year-old sister, Evie. On my dad's side, all we had left was Grandma Vance. She lived like a hermit in an old shack up on the mountain. My mom couldn't stand her. The locals avoided her during the day, but at night, People would secretly drive up to her place for remedies when the regular doctors gave up on them. I didn't care about any of that back then. I was 9 years old, and my main job was babysitting my little sister while Mom was at work, making sure we didn't freeze to death in our drafty trailer. The winter of 1982 was brutally cold. The heater in our trailer barely worked. Mom would leave for her night shift, and we would go to bed. I slept on the living room couch wrapped in sleeping bags, and Evie was in her crib nearby. Every night around 2 a.m., she would wake up freezing and start crying. The floor was like ice, and I really didn't want to get out of my sleeping bag, so I'd often just lie there pretending to be asleep, hoping she would tire herself out. Then one night, I heard a sound, something scratching at the window where the screen was torn. I looked over and saw a massive black cat climbing into the room. It was almost the size of a bobcat. It jumped quietly right into Evie's crib. I froze. I was terrified to move, thinking it was going to attack my sister. But the cat just curled up on Evie's chest and started purring really loudly. Evie calmed down immediately, snuggled into it, and went back to sleep. I didn't close my eyes until morning. By the time it got light out, the cat was gone. I searched the whole room but couldn't find any trace of it. This went on all winter. The cat would come at night, keep Evie warm, and disappear by morning. I never told my mom, who would believe me. A couple of years went by, and we were in elementary school. One afternoon, Evie and I were walking home along the side of the highway, and we saw that same black cat. It was sitting on an old mailbox. When it saw us, it jumped down, walked over to Evie, and started rubbing against her legs. I reached out to pet it, but the cat growled and backed away, and then it looked up right into my eyes. Honestly, a cold sweat broke out on my neck. Animals don't have eyes like that. It was a completely conscious, heavy stare of an old, tired human being. In that moment, I knew exactly what was going on, even if my kid brain didn't want to accept it. In the fall of '86, Evie and her friend convinced me to take them blackberry picking in the woods. We got distracted, wandered off the trail, and got completely lost. It gets dark really fast in the Ozarks, and it gets freezing at night. The girls started crying, and I was panicking, trying to gather branches in the dark to build some kind of shelter, sure we were going to freeze. It was pitch black when I suddenly felt something rub against my leg. I turned around, and there was that massive black cat. Its eyes were glowing in the dark. It looked at me, turned around, and started walking through the bushes, looking back every few seconds like it was saying, "Follow me." So we did. By 10 p.m., it led us straight into the backyard of our trailer, and then it just vanished into the dark. A week later, a rumor went around town. Grandma Vance had passed away. The local sheriff said she suffered a stroke and had been lying paralyzed in her house for a few days before she died. Those days lined up exactly with the night we got lost in the woods. It seems like, while she was dying, she somehow managed to come find us and lead us home. Today, my sister Evie lives down in New Orleans. She constantly has people lining up at her door when regular doctors tell them there's no hope. Her gift showed up almost immediately after our grandma died. And yeah, she has a massive black cat living in her house. I never, ever look it in the eyes. In the late 90s, in our small town in Indiana, kids spent all day outside. Our favorite spot was an old, flooded limestone quarry. A month prior, a tragedy had happened there. A kid from another neighborhood jumped in and never surfaced. Police divers couldn't find the body because the visibility was zero and the bottom was full of construction debris. We were 8 years old. We were stupid. We thought we were invincible, and that incident didn't stop us at all. We kept going back. We had this idiotic game. We would take pieces of cardboard and slide down the steep clay banks right toward the water, trying to break with our sneakers in the mud at the very edge. It was a hot July day. I slide down, try to break, but my foot slips on the wet clay. I tumble off the edge and plunge headfirst into the water. The quarry water was brown with silt. You couldn't see an inch in front of your face. I didn't panic immediately because I was a good swimmer. I started kicking to surface, but suddenly I felt a sharp yank downward. I thought my foot had caught on an old branch or a piece of rebar. I tried to jerk my leg free, but the grip only tightened. And I swear on my life, it wasn't a branch, it was fingers. Small, freezing cold fingers wrapped tightly around my right ankle. I was violently pulled deeper. I panicked, opened my mouth, and filthy water flooded my throat. I started thrashing hysterically, purely on survival instinct. Suddenly, someone grabbed the collar of my t-shirt and yanked me up with incredible force. My head broke the surface. It was my friend Tyler. He was lying on his stomach on the muddy bank, cursing in panic, dragging me out. I collapsed into the mud. I was vomiting up quarry water and silt, coughing so hard tears were streaming down my face. Tyler was yelling at me, calling me an idiot and saying I almost pulled him in. But I was just lying on my side, staring at the water. Right in the spot where I had just been thrashing, the water was still bubbling. And through that murky, brown layer, just a couple of feet below the surface, I saw a pale shape. It wasn't a monster. It looked like a bloated, white human face, slowly sinking back into the darkness. I squeezed my eyes shut and rubbed them with my dirty hands. When I looked back, there were only ripples. Tyler hadn't seen a thing. I didn't tell my parents when I got home. I was terrified of getting grounded. I started having nightmares, waking up in a cold sweat, gasping for air. Psychologists would say it was textbook PTSD. A week later, our friend group went back to the quarry. I didn't want to go, but when you're 8, you're terrified of being called a coward. I flat out refused to slide down the hill. I just sat at the very edge of the bank, hugging my knees, staring at the water. I felt physically sick just from the smell of the silt. And then, the water right below me made a weird gurgling sound. A few large bubbles rose to the surface. I froze, staring into the dark depths. And suddenly, literally inches away from my sneaker, a pale, bluish hand slowly broke the surface of the murky water. It wasn't reaching for me. It just floated up, like a bobber, its fingers lightly scraping against the muddy clay bank. My brain completely short-circuited from primal terror. I let out a hoarse, lung-shredding scream, scrambled backward up the mud on all fours, jumped up, and ran. I ran all the way home without stopping, and without explaining anything to my friends. They never found that boy's body. The police concluded it had gotten pinned under heavy debris at the bottom. Maybe what I saw was just a trick of the light combined with my traumatized brain. But to this day, when I take a bath and look at the water, I sometimes remember those freezing fingers on my ankle. And it terrifies me to think, what if he was just looking for something to grab onto so he could pull himself out? This first happened to my cousin Caleb and his mom, my Aunt Sarah. They went up for the weekend to our old inherited family cabin in the mountains of Tennessee. The place was remote, with barely any cell service. That night, exhausted from working around the house, they went to sleep in the main room. My aunt on the bed and Caleb on an old pull-out couch. In the middle of the night, Caleb woke up to a strange sound. It wasn't a scream, but a wet, strained wheezing. He turned on the light and saw Aunt Sarah lying flat on her back, clutching her throat, literally choking as she tried to pull something invisible off her chest. Caleb jumped up, shook her shoulders, and the attack immediately stopped. She coughed heavily, gasping for air. In the morning, they drove to the local urgent care. The doctors examined her and found absolutely nothing physically wrong. No heart or respiratory issues. They chalked it up to a severe panic attack or sleep apnea. But Aunt Sarah was adamant. She told Caleb, "I woke up because something heavy jumped onto the foot of the bed. I thought a stray cat had gotten into the cabin. But then it crawled up the blanket, sat on my chest, and started pressing on my neck." When Caleb told me this, I just assumed they had psyched themselves out in a creepy old cabin. Until it happened to me. I live in a completely normal suburb in Ohio. We don't have any cats or dogs, just a couple of parakeets in the kitchen. About a month after their trip, I was asleep in my room. In the middle of the night, my leg jerked violently. You know, that hypnic jerk where you feel like you're falling in your sleep. I opened my eyes slightly, realized everything was fine, and started to drift off again. And then the bed shook. Thump. The mattress at the foot of my bed depressed heavily. The springs actually creaked. I completely froze. Caleb's story instantly flashed in my mind. I lay there, perfectly still, hoping I was just imagining it. But then I physically felt a heavy weight slowly crawling up the blanket, stepping paw by paw, from my feet, toward my stomach. Panic completely took over. I didn't wait for it to reach my chest. I gathered all my strength, violently kicked the blanket off, and screamed. My mom came running into the room and flicked on the light. The room was empty. Naturally, I got scolded. My mom told me I was reading too many scary stories online and to go back to sleep. I stayed awake until dawn, Googling what happened, and stumbled upon forums talking about mimics or hags, folklore entities that feed on fear and learn to imitate the voices of your loved ones to mess with your head. I thought it was just internet BS. The next afternoon after school, I was sitting in my room doing homework. My mom was downstairs cooking dinner. Suddenly, I clearly heard my mom's voice coming from the hallway. "Chloe, come down here for a second." I walked down to the kitchen. "What's up?" She turned away from the stove, looking genuinely confused. "What do you mean?" I didn't say anything. I just shrugged, figured I misheard her over the TV, and went back upstairs. About 15 minutes later, the voice called out again. This time, it sounded like it was right outside my cracked bedroom door. "Chloe, come here." It was my mom's voice, a completely normal, everyday tone. No demonic rasps, no cinematic ghost effects. Just my mom calling me from the hallway. I walked out of my room. The hallway was empty. I went downstairs, feeling a bit annoyed. My mom was still chopping vegetables at the sink. "Mom, seriously, stop messing with me. What do you want?" I asked. She put the knife down, wiped her hands on a towel, and looked at me with a dead serious expression. "Chloe, I didn't call you. I haven't opened my mouth in half an hour." My stomach completely dropped. I looked at her. She looked at me. We both realized that I wasn't crazy, and that we had just come to the same horrifying conclusion. There was something else in the house, and it was currently upstairs. I silently went up, grabbed my notebooks, came back down, and we sat together in the kitchen for the rest of the evening, listening to every single creak coming from the second floor. We never figured out what it was. 3 years ago, I lost my younger brother. He was buried in an old municipal cemetery in our town in Pennsylvania. It was late November, so it got dark very early. I was working construction, pulling double shifts, so I could only make it to his grave after 6 p.m. Twilight had already fallen, and I could see my breath in the cold air. But the cemetery didn't seem empty. Walking along the gravel path, I saw dark silhouettes in the distance, people sitting on benches, standing near trees. I remember thinking, wow, I guess I'm not the only one working late. Other people don't have time to visit during the day either. I walked up to my brother's plot. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a woman sitting on the stone bench right next to it. She was dressed completely wrong for the weather. It was below freezing, but she was wearing a faded, thin gray coat in some heavily outdated style and a weird little hat. She was sitting perfectly still, just staring straight ahead. Probably a local homeless woman, or someone with dementia, I thought. I didn't want to stare, so I turned my back to her, pulled some fresh flowers out of my backpack, and crouched down by my brother's headstone. And then I heard a sound, a shuffling noise, like someone dragging their shoes on the gravel, and it was right behind my back. Way too close. I flinched and whipped around. This woman was standing literally 2 feet away from me. She had moved completely silently. Up close, she looked awful. Her face was pale, grayish, and her eyes looked sunken. But she didn't smell like booze or unwashed body odor like a homeless person might. She smelled like a stagnant basement and damp earth. She leaned in toward me and spoke in this incredibly flat, quiet voice. "Get out. This is mine." I was taken aback. I'm a pretty big guy, but her tone made my stomach drop. "Lady, back up," I said, standing up to my full height. She didn't move an inch. She just kept staring at me with those empty eyes. I instinctively took a step back and glanced around. And that's when it hit me. Those dark silhouettes I had seen in the distance on the benches. They weren't moving. None of them were adjusting their jackets or shifting their weight from the cold. They were sitting in absolute, unnatural stillness. But I could feel it in my bones. Every single one of them was looking in my direction. You know that feeling when your body just screams at you to run? I didn't argue with it. I just turned around and fast walked, practically jogging toward the exit. I didn't look back until I reached the brightly lit main gates. There was a security booth at the entrance. I practically busted through the door, breathing heavily. The night guard, an older guy with a thermos of coffee, looked at me surprised. I started frantically explaining that there was a crazy woman wandering around Section 4, that she got up in my face, and that there were a bunch of weird people just sitting out there in the dark. The guard listened to me without interrupting. He didn't reach for his radio. He didn't call the cops. He just let out a heavy sigh and took a sip of his coffee. "Kid, you're not the first one to get spooked out there," he said tiredly. "Cops can't help, especially now when the ground starts to freeze." "What do you mean?" I asked, confused. "There's an unhinged woman out there." "She ain't unhinged. She's from the first layer," he replied, looking out the window at the dark rows of headstones. I stared at him like he was crazy. "We've been out of space for 40 years, the guard explained in a completely casual tone. "The city has been double-selling old plots for decades. They don't dig up the old boxes. They just bury the new bodies right on top of them, double-stacked. And the folks who have been resting down there since the 1900s, they don't really like it." The guard shrugged. "I'd be pissed off, too. You're lying down there in the dark, and all the flowers and tears go to some stranger they dropped right on top of your chest." I had my brother's remains exhumed and moved to a different cemetery outside of town 2 months later. And if you ever go visit a loved one's grave in the evening, and you notice someone sitting on a nearby bench wearing strange clothes, just leave the flowers and walk away without looking back. It was 1998. I was living with my Aunt Martha in an old house in Pennsylvania. My aunt restored furniture, so our place was always full of antiques. That summer, we found a young raven on the side of the road with a busted wing. We nursed him back to health and named him Buster. He lived in our spacious mudroom, freely hopping around the floor, and was very tame. In that same mudroom stood my aunt's newest acquisition, a heavy 7-foot-tall floor mirror. Because of its age, the silvering on the back had started to flake, leaving these cloudy black spots all over the glass. At first, Buster loved it. He would sit in front of the mirror for hours, studying his reflection. But about a month later, the bird's behavior completely changed. He started actively avoiding that corner of the room. If he accidentally got too close to the glass, he would puff up his feathers, make these weird, distressed clicking noises, and scramble away into the kitchen. I walked up to the glass a few times, but I never saw anything besides my own reflection and those creepy black age spots. Everything happened one night, around 3 a.m. I woke up to a dull thudding and a strange commotion. It wasn't a cinematic monster scream. It was the sound of a bird frantically thrashing against the walls. My aunt and I went out to the mudroom and flipped on the lights. Buster had backed himself under a side table in the furthest corner. He was panting heavily, his beak wide open, and there were a few tail feathers scattered on the hardwood floor in front of the mirror from where he had been thrashing around. Aunt Martha calmly walked over, gently picked the bird up, put him in his cage, and covered it with a towel to calm him down. Then, she turned to the mirror. She stood there in total silence for about 10 seconds. I was standing in the hallway doorway, and I saw her back go completely stiff. She didn't scream. She just spoke to me in a very quiet, shaky voice. "Chloe, take a step back. Do not come in here." My aunt grabbed a heavy wool blanket off a chair, walked up to the mirror, and draped it over the frame. And that's when I saw something weird. The blanket didn't just hang there. It seemed to cling to the glass, like there was a massive amount of static electricity. As my aunt tried to adjust the edges, I clearly heard a tap. A dull, double tap. But it didn't come from the outside. The sound came from inside the glass itself. Aunt Martha instantly yanked her hands back, locked the mudroom door, and we went to sleep in her room. I woke up the next morning to the sound of my uncle's pickup truck pulling into the driveway. He and my aunt silently carried the mirror out, wrapped in a tarp, loaded it into the truck, and took it straight to the county dump. My aunt absolutely refused to talk about it for 15 years. It wasn't until I graduated college, during dinner one night, that I brought it up. She sighed heavily and finally told me what she saw. When she walked up to the mirror that night, the reflection was wrong. She saw herself, but the background didn't match reality. In the mirror, the hallway behind her was completely pitch black, even though all our lights were on. And standing in that darkness, right behind her reflection, was a tall, dark silhouette. She said that when she threw the blanket over the glass, she didn't feel icy hands or demons. She felt the glass under the fabric become warm. And that double tap from the inside happened the exact second the dark silhouette in the reflection took a step forward. Our Raven lived with us for a long time after that. But since that night, he physically refused to enter any room if he could see even a small mirror inside it. It was late summer. I went fly fishing at a remote mountain creek about 5 miles away from the nearest dirt road. The sun was just starting to set when I suddenly heard a woman scream. It was a piercing, blood-curdling shriek of absolute terror coming from the dense brush. Any normal person would be scared, but I couldn't just leave a woman in danger. I dropped my fishing rod and ran toward the sound. I had no idea I was running straight into a trap that had been set almost a century ago. I was pushing through the thick bushes when I suddenly heard a man's voice. "Hey!" I whipped around. About 30 feet away, leaning against a tree trunk, was a tall, unnaturally gaunt man. He was wearing faded denim overalls and chewing on a wad of tobacco. I swear on my life, he wasn't there a second ago. "Did you hear that scream?" I asked, out of breath. "Someone needs help!" The man spit on the ground and answered in a completely flat, dead voice. "Don't go up there. It ain't your business." "What do you mean? Someone is getting hurt." "Just turn around and walk back to your truck, boy," he said, pushing off the tree and silently melting back into the shadows of the brush. It was creepy, but the woman's screaming had abruptly stopped, and I was terrified I was too late. I kept pushing forward. About 10 minutes later, I broke through the tree line into a clearing, and I froze. Sitting in the middle of the deep woods was a rotting, ancient log cabin. There were no power lines, no cars around, and sitting on the front porch was the exact same man I had just met on the trail. Only now, he was shirtless, casually sharpening a hunting knife. A cold sweat broke out on my neck. It was physically impossible for him to outrun me through the dense forest, let alone have time to take his shirt off and sit down. While I was standing there in shock, the man with the knife stood up and locked his eyes on me. The door creaked open, and a woman stepped out of the cabin. It was too late to run. I noticed a shotgun leaning against the doorframe. If these were crazy backwoods hermits, I'd take a bullet to the back before I even reached the creek. I put my hands up and forced the dumbest smile I could muster. "Evening, I'm so sorry, I was foraging for mushrooms and got totally turned around. Could you point me toward the highway?" The man slowly stepped off the porch. "Mushrooms, huh? Where's your bag, mushroom hunter?" "Lost it while I was crawling through the briars," I lied, trying to keep my voice from shaking. The woman suddenly gave me a warm, overly polite smile. "It's getting dark, sweetie. You'll break your neck out there in the woods tonight. Come on inside, have some supper with us, and my husband will walk you to the road in the morning." The man's eyes told a different story, but his hand rested on the handle of his knife. It wasn't an invitation. It was a demand. I realized my only hope was to play along, wait for them to fall asleep, and sneak out. Inside, the cabin smelled like damp earth and old grease. We ate some kind of meat stew for dinner. I forced it down, trying not to think about what it was made of. They didn't have spare beds, so they tossed an old quilt on the floor near the hearth for me. I laid down, turned to the wall, and pretended to be asleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard a loud thud coming from the kitchen. Something heavy had dropped. Then came an angry whisper. "You clumsy fool," the man hissed. "Quiet. You'll wake him up." "Hand me the axe," the woman whispered back, and there was this sick, animalistic excitement in her voice. "We haven't had fresh meat in a month." My heart nearly exploded out of my chest. Pure adrenaline flooded my veins. I waited until they were shuffling around in the far corner, silently jumped up in just my socks, bolted to the front door, and slipped out into the night. I ran like I had never run in my life. Branches were tearing at my face. I tripped, busted my knees, but I just kept running blindly through the pitch-black forest. Eventually, I stumbled upon an old rusted drainage pipe under a logging road. I crawled inside and hid there until dawn, shivering and listening to every snapping twig. In the morning, I hiked out to the highway and hitched a ride to the nearest gas station. An old man with white hair was working the register. I bought a coffee and, still shaking, asked him if he knew the reclusive couple that lived in the old log cabin by the creek. The old man stopped wiping the counter. He looked at me like he had just seen a ghost. "Son," he said softly, "there ain't no cabin by that creek. Nothing but charred foundation stones." According to him, back during the Great Depression in the 1930s, people started going missing in those woods. At first, folks blamed it on bear attacks, but when a local teenager disappeared, the men in town formed a search party. They stumbled upon a cabin in a clearing where that exact couple lived. The old man lowered his voice. "The search party demanded to look in the root cellar, because the whole property smelled like death. What they found down there, let's just say they didn't bother calling the sheriff. They found the belongings of the missing people, and that teenage boy tied up and crying in the corner. The locals rescued the boy, barred the doors with those monsters inside, doused the cabin in kerosene, and burned it to the ground." I stood there holding my coffee cup, unable to breathe. That night, I had eaten dinner and tried to sleep in a place that hadn't existed for 80 years. I don't know how I managed to escape, but I know one thing for sure. That couple is still wandering those woods, and they are still very hungry. It was the mid-90s. My mom and I went to visit a friend of hers on the other side of town. This friend had her severely ill mother living on the ground floor. The old lady was on hospice, actively dying, and hadn't gotten out of her hospital bed in months. Us kids were absolutely terrified of going into her room. It always had that heavy smell of medicine and old age. We were playing in the hallway, and my bouncy ball accidentally rolled right into her bedroom. I had to go get it. I don't remember everything that happened in there. My memory only works in flashes. I remember crawling under the metal bed frame to reach the ball, and suddenly, a bony, freezing, cold hand reaches down and grabs my wrist. The weirdest part is I didn't cry. I just completely froze. According to my mom, I was in that room for way too long. She finally walked in, saw me just sitting on the floor, staring blankly at the wall, picked me up, and we drove straight home. The real nightmare began that evening, around 9 p.m. My mom and I were lying on the couch in our living room, watching TV. I was lying on the edge, my head near the armrest. The only light in the room was coming from the TV screen. I looked up and saw her. That same dying old woman was in our living room. She wasn't floating near the ceiling like a movie ghost. She was perched right on the narrow armrest of the couch, her legs crossed underneath her. It looked absolutely unnatural and terrifying, because a physically bedridden person could never balance on the narrow edge of a sofa like that. She leaned in, silently reached out her gray hand and grabbed my wrist. Her fingers were like ice, and she started pulling me up toward the dark hallway. That's when I screamed. It was a wild, uncontrollable, terrified shriek. Now, here is my mom's version of the events. She was watching TV. Suddenly, completely out of nowhere, I start screaming my lungs out. My mom turns around and sees a horrifying sight. I am reaching my arm up into completely empty space, and I am being dragged in that direction. My little body literally started sliding up the upholstery of the couch toward the armrest. My mom panicked, lunged at me, grabbed my waist, and yanked me back with everything she had. She says she will never forget that moment. There were no Hollywood special effects, just a dull, heavy resistance. It felt like she was trying to pull me out of thick mud, or like my arm was caught in a machine. My mom dug her heels into the floor and screamed out of pure fear because she could physically feel a dead weight pulling from the other side. She yanked me back so hard that we both tumbled off the couch and crashed onto the floor, and the exact second we hit the floor, it all abruptly stopped. The resistance vanished. I was just crying in her arms. My mom sat with me on the floor until the sun came up, turning on every single light in the house. A week later, my mom's friend called. Her bedridden mother had finally passed away. The year was 1994. My dad, a former mechanic at a Chevy dealership, had lost his job after a severe back injury. My mom had walked out on us a year prior. Left with 2 kids and barely a dime to his name, my dad had to sell our suburban house. For pennies on the dollar at a foreclosure auction, he bought a rotting, old farmhouse out in Backwoods County, Ohio. It was an incredibly isolated place, surrounded by miles of dead cornfields, under a perpetually gray sky, in absolute dead silence. The house itself smelled like dust, mouse droppings, and dry rot. My dad had to take graveyard shifts at a local lumber mill, so my 7-year-old sister Lily and I were often left home alone at night. I was 10, and I felt like the man of the house. The weird things started happening during our second week there. We slept in the same bedroom on the 2nd floor. One morning, I woke up feeling suffocated. The room was hot, and my throat was parched. I turned my head, and saw a glass sitting on my nightstand. It was an old, thick, Depression-era glass, the kind we definitely didn't own, and it was filled to the brim with milk. An identical glass was sitting on Lily's nightstand. I figured my dad had brought them up for us before he left for his shift. But when I brought the glass to my lips, I froze. The milk wasn't sour, but it smelled wrong. It had a harsh chemical odor, like bitter almonds mixed with rusty pennies. My stomach instinctively churned. I poured it down the bathroom sink. Lily did the same. When my dad got home that morning, we thanked him for the milk. He looked at us with bloodshot, exhausted eyes and frowned. "What are you talking about? I haven't bought milk in a week. The fridge is totally empty." Lily and I exchanged a look, but we weren't scared. In our naive, childish minds, we came up with a theory. There was the ghost of a kind woman living in the house. We called her Mother. We decided that she saw how lonely we were without our real mom, and she was just trying to take care of us. The glasses of milk would appear every couple of weeks. We never drank them because of that awful, bitter smell, but we would always politely whisper, "Thank you, Mother," into the empty room, and then dump them down the toilet. But the strangest display of her care was the chair. Downstairs in the living room, among the junk left behind by the previous owners, was a massive, high-backed oak chair with clawed feet. It was impossibly heavy. We shoved it into the furthest, darkest corner of the room to make space in front of our bulky CRT television so we could play Sega Genesis. That's when we noticed the movement. Lily and I would be sitting on the carpet, mashing controller buttons, the TV volume blasting. Suddenly, cutting right through the 8-bit music, we'd hear a sound. Scrape. A long, agonizing groan of heavy wood dragging across the old linoleum floor. We'd turn around. The chair was no longer in the corner. It had moved 2 feet in our direction. We never actually saw it moving. But the second we turned back to the TV, it would take another step. Scrape. Another foot closer. Instead of running out of the house screaming, we felt this weird sense of pity. "She's lonely over there in the dark," Lily would whisper. "Mother just wants to be closer to us, so she can watch TV." The chair always crawled toward the exact same spot. It aimed for the dead center of the living room, directly underneath a massive, exposed oak load-bearing beam on the vaulted ceiling. Once it reached the dead center, it would stop. The next day, grunting and straining, we would drag that heavy chair all the way back to the corner. And by evening, the game would start again. Mother would leave us milk, and then she would inch her chair closer to us. To us, it felt like an act of incredible, protective love. We lived in that house for a year before my dad got a great job offer in another state, and we moved away, leaving Mother behind forever. 20 years went by. I grew up, got a degree in history, and started working as a county archivist. A few months ago, we were digitizing old Ohio newspaper records. I loaded a microfilm reel of the Blackwood County Gazette from October 1956 into the scanner. I was lazily scrolling through the pages on my monitor when my heart suddenly skipped a beat. Right there on the screen was a picture of our old farmhouse. The headline read, "Tragedy on the Farm. Widow driven to madness." My hand started shaking as I read the text. The article detailed the story of the previous owner, Eleanor Vance. In 1956, the bank was about to foreclose on her farm. Eleanor, unable to handle the pressure, completely snapped. The article stated that late one evening, she poured her 2 young children a glass of milk each, but she laced the milk with a massive dose of strychnine rat poison. The children drank the milk in their second-floor bedroom and died in agony. I stopped breathing. The harsh, bitter almond smell of the milk on my nightstand instantly flooded my memory. I forced myself to keep reading. After making sure her children were dead, Eleanor walked downstairs into the living room. She took a thick hemp rope, threw it over the central exposed oak beam, and hanged herself. But it wasn't the text of the article that made me run out of the archives and throw up in the bathroom. It was the crime scene photograph. The grainy black and white image showed our exact living room. In the middle of the room, hanging from that central beam, was Eleanor's body. And directly beneath her dangling feet, knocked over in the dead center of the room, was that massive, high-backed oak chair. In that single second, my entire childhood was turned upside down. The illusion shattered. Our kind mother wasn't trying to take care of us. She wasn't moving the chair so she could sit and watch TV with us. She was a monster stuck on a loop. She was leaving us poison. And while we sat on the carpet, she was dragging that chair, inch by inch, to the center of the room, right under that beam, getting ready to hang herself again, the exact second we took our final sip. My great-grandmother, Mabel, survived the Great Depression and managed to feed 6 children. But our family knows the truth. She didn't survive because of luck. She survived because she realized exactly when to get rid of an absolutely cursed object. A piece of gold that drove every single person who claimed it completely insane. During the roaring 1920s, my great-grandmother Mabel worked as a head maid in a massive mansion owned by a West Virginia coal baron. The baron's wife, Mrs. Sterling, was incredibly kind and treated my great-grandmother very well. One day, Mr. Sterling returned from Europe and brought his wife an expensive antique. It was a heavy, solid gold brooch shaped like an Ouroboros, a snake biting its own tail. The scales were carved with terrifying, lifelike detail, and it had 2 tiny, glittering emeralds for eyes. It was a beautiful piece of jewelry, but it gave off this incredibly cold, unsettling vibe. Mrs. Sterling wore that brooch every single day, but her happiness didn't last long. Barely a week later, this healthy, vibrant woman came down with severe pneumonia and a strange, wasting fever. She was fading right before our eyes. The doctors were completely baffled. One evening, as Mabel was changing her bedsheets, a frail, exhausted Mrs. Sterling ripped the golden snake off her nightgown, shoved it into my great-grandmother's hand, and rasped, "Take it. Hide it. It's too heavy. It's suffocating me." A few days later, Mrs. Sterling was sent away to a sanatorium, and she never came back. Great-grandmother Mabel hid the brooch at the bottom of an old cedar chest. She had absolutely no intention of wearing it. The thing gave her the creeps. And then came 1929. The Great Depression hit the Appalachian coal towns so hard that people were literally starving in the streets. The mines shut down, and the Sterling mansion was boarded up. Desperate to keep her kids from starving, Mabel dug out the golden snake and took it to the local pawnbroker, an old jeweler named Mr. Horowitz. He examined the brooch under his loupe, went completely pale, and silently placed a stack of bills on the counter. It was enough money to feed our family for an entire year. But 3 days later, a shockwave hit the town. Mr. Horowitz's pawn shop had burned to the ground in the middle of the night, and the old jeweler perished inside. Officially, the police ruled it a tragic accident. But the locals knew the truth. The day before the fire, our county's corrupt, ruthless sheriff, Big Jim Callahan, had walked into the pawn shop. The sheriff saw the brooch in the display case and demanded Horowitz sell it to him for pennies. The old man flat out refused. The very next night, his shop went up in flames. Naturally, the golden snake wasn't found in the ashes. A few days later, Sheriff Callahan was proudly wearing it pinned to his jacket lapel. He had taken what he wanted without paying a dime. And that is when the object really went to work. Sheriff Callahan had always been a cruel man, but over the next year, he devolved into absolute paranoid madness. He refused to ever take the golden snake off. He started claiming that the townspeople were spying on him, that everyone was plotting to steal his treasure. He stopped sleeping. His eyes sank deep into his skull, and his skin turned a sickly gray, exactly like Mrs. Sterling's had. His wife and children were so terrified that they packed their bags and fled to relatives in another state. Callahan was left entirely alone. He barricaded all the doors in his house, nailed heavy wooden boards over the windows, and sat in the dark for days with a loaded shotgun. The climax happened late in the fall. Neighbors woke up to the strong smell of smoke. Thick black clouds were billowing from under the sheriff's roof. The fire department arrived quickly, but they couldn't get inside. The doors were heavily barricaded from the inside with solid oak furniture. By the time they smashed through the boarded-up windows, the interior of the house was completely gutted. When the smoke cleared and the firemen made their way down into the basement, they found the sheriff. He hadn't tried to escape the fire. He had backed himself into the furthest, darkest corner of the basement, hiding from imaginary burglars, and simply died of severe smoke inhalation. But the creepiest part was discovered by the local coroner when he was examining the body. The sheriff's right hand was locked into a tight, white-knuckled fist. Rigor mortis had set in so severely that the paramedics literally had to pry his fingers open by force. When his palm finally opened, the medical examiners recoiled. The sheriff had been clutching that golden brooch. He had been squeezing it with such animalistic, manic force that the thick gold pin had pierced straight through his palm, and the golden snake was just staring up at the doctors with its cold, emerald eyes. My great-grandmother lived a long, full life, and until her dying day, she always gave us the same piece of advice. If you ever pick up an antique, and it feels just a little too heavy for its size, put it back down and walk away.